Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Peter Fisher, a director at Bennett's Associates Architects, and I'm going to run through really two parts to the slides I'm going to run through. The first bit is largely about our own impact as an organisation, so our organisational footprint, and then somehow an understanding of that has really helped us understand the footprints of some of our clients and some of the issues that we face going forwards. Now, the context of this is entirely about workplace. I mean, our workload is about a third of it is workplace. The other large components are around culture and higher education. But we've done, it's over 30 years really of workplace projects, many of which have been relatively leading in sustainability at the time. From bottom right on this slide, Powergen in the early 90s, all the way through Wessex Water, New Street Square, Hampshire County Council's refurbishment, and then through into the King's Cross development and a building that I'm going to talk about a fair bit for Land Securities. But I think that more than any time, the rate of change has just exponentially increased over the last 2 years or so, and I think that's entirely positive. And there is just, I think we're all aware, there is an unprecedented call for change now, and that's pressing. We know it's pressing, but that is also destabilizing for some people. It's incredibly exciting for others. And some of the drivers now that are coming out of that, I think this slide is really showing that transition from regulatory pressures through to investor pressures. And I think that the change, the demand from the previous slide, I think certainly in workplace, and I think this is different in some other sectors, but within workplace, I can't remember the last time that we worked on a project where the key driver was regulatory. It is increasingly around voluntary commitments, particularly science-based targets, and really an understanding as well of GRESB, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmarking Index, which is increasingly important for commercial property developers, both their own rating, but also the way in which they raise finance. And I think that has that as a driver is actually very positive. I think as architects we can sometimes be sniffy about when money people get involved, but it is a great driver for that. But it is also a huge threat for a lot of developers. So part of this is really us understanding our impact, understanding, if you like, the clients of commercial developers ultimately as tenants and what the drivers are for them. And science-based targets is something that I think we were the first architects in the world to have a pre-science-based targets for our own operations. And understanding this has been quite important to us. We've used it as a way of understanding our own metrics for projects as well as for our own business. But broadly, I mean, Gary talked about this in much more detail just now. But yeah, at the moment, we're online for 4 degrees of warming. I mean, for context, when we were 4 degrees colder than we are today, we were under a mile of ice in London. So that's a real sort of, these numbers don't sound big, but they're actually incredibly significant. And even with the best policies at the moment, we're probably online for 2.5 degrees. And what we need to be hitting is that trajectory, which is the green line, down to 1.5, and we've used that trajectory quite a lot, and that is used across a number of targets that have been set. And that can be used as an individual business, and it can be used as targets for projects. Now, 3 or 4 years ago, we set out 20 clear numeric targets for our own business, and this is the report or the document on the left-hand side of this slide. And that set out aims that we had, and that was across the way that we designed, the impacts that we have, and the impacts that we have with our own people. And then the result of that is the diagram on the right hand side, which is a breakdown of our entire carbon emissions. So this is scope 1 and 2 plus scope 3 emissions, and understanding that in a much more granular detail has been very, very helpful. And we're finding that is actually quite a similar profile to many service-based organisations, where roughly the dark blue and the red are our scope 1 and 2, broadly our heating and electricity use, and roughly 40% is business travel. Now, this isn't from the previous year. That's obviously changed quite a lot. COVID has had a massive impact on the green bit, it's had much less of an impact on the red bit, actually, on electricity use because of computers still wearing away in offices. But we now understand a great deal more about the way that we might be able to reduce that. And we're commissioning a series of studies. We've got 3 studios in London, Manchester and Edinburgh, a series of studies on how we can reduce our own environmental footprint within those studios, this being the London studio. And it is actually very, very difficult dealing with existing buildings. It really is. It's potentially huge amounts of retrofit to those, but some of the really quick wins are around computer use. So a huge chunk of that red portion of electricity use is small power, it's servers, and moving to much more efficient computers, to off-site servers. That has a significant impact on our carbon emissions, and that isn't simply a transfer of scope 2 emissions into scope 3. It is also a reduction. Off-site server farms tend to reduce your overall carbon emissions by about at least a half, if not more than that. And most of the UK Green Building Council targets for office buildings, for example, are actually predicated on the overwhelming transfer to cloud computing. So that's actually really quite significant. And then this is actually a graph of our own carbon footprint, and it is the science-based trajectories are shown in the dotted lines, and then this is our progress against those. The last year has probably been artificial on the business travel because we basically haven't had any, and I think there will be some resumption of that. But trying to keep that under control is a really, really important part of our profile going forwards. But also you can see that our energy consumption hasn't come down as rapidly as you would expect it to, given that we weren't in the offices. And that is actually over the last year, the first 6 months that didn't come down. I think as we've transferred to cloud computing, that has come down. Now, these are all based on what's called location factors. So the fact that we purchase 100% renewable electricity doesn't really count to these. It's not market-based, it's location-based, so it takes the average of wherever in the world you are. And we think that that is important anyway, that you can't simply offset by having renewable energy. And so we both purchase renewable energy, but we also offset through the UN Climate Neutral programme, even though we're purchasing renewable energy. And we think that having that sort of double accounting is actually quite important within these. Now, one thing, and I've always felt a little bit uncomfortable with this in some ways, but one thing that we do as well is anonymous personal carbon footprints. It's voluntary and it's anonymised, but this is across our staff to understand their own personal carbon footprints. And actually out of that, you find the biggest impact you can have as a business is often enabling your own staff to lead more low carbon lifestyles. And so out of that came something called Climate Perks. We were one of the original sort of founding members of that, which is the big, if you look on the graph on the left hand side, the green bar, which is really the big difference between the lowest and the highest impacts that our staff have, that is flights broadly. And so anything that we can do to enable people to take fewer flights is a positive. It's nudge theory. And so we have something in place now that enables people to take at least 2 low carbon travel days per year, which increases the time that they have to take travel. So it increases their holiday basically. And that actually has a way bigger impact than all the offsetting that we could do. Obviously during the last year, it's not had that much impact, but hopefully there will be a resumption of some normality relatively soon. And then just moving on, having understood science-based targets in a bit more detail, this is becoming a very, very significant driver for corporate portfolios. The diagram on the left is the uptake of science-based targets and science-based commitments amongst FTSE 250 companies, and that has gone from less than 20% in 2017 to approaching 50% during 2019, and that has actually accelerated during 2020. And then the other graph is the amount of floor space that is occupied in central London by companies with net zero carbon science-based targets for 2030. And we think that the amount of lease events is probably approaching something like 20 million square feet now across London for people who will be looking for net zero carbon floor space by 2030. And that's an incredibly significant driver for many developers, and understanding that I think is really, really key to us being able to help them, to help the commercial organisations have improve their carbon emissions. And then if we just look at how significant this is for us as individuals, and I think as soon as there's a connection between an individual's carbon emissions and their corporate ones and actually global targets, then it becomes a little bit more intelligible. And there's quite a lot of work going on at the moment, particularly within Landsec, for example, looking at how they can make sustainability and carbon emissions more relatable for people. And if we take the UK, where depending on what you count, we're probably somewhere around 8 tonnes per person per year. The global average is about 5, and these are the targets that we've got to be hitting globally. We've got to be down at 2.5 by 2030, dropping to less than a tonne by 2050. So those are really, really quite significant drops. And then there comes a point where you begin looking at what are the impacts of actual corporations. And so here, an average service company is somewhere between 1 and 3 tonnes per person. And, at Bennetts Associates, we're about a tonne at the moment, but we've really got to drag that down quite a lot. And the bottom part of that bar, the scope 1 and 2, gas, electricity broadly, that on average is somewhere between 0.5 and 1 tonne per year of any individual's carbon footprint is really allied to the workplace that they're based in. And I think there is a huge driver amongst corporate portfolios to begin to understand that and drive that much more readily. And so when we begin looking at, these are setting out some of the graphs or targets that Gary was talking about just earlier. This is looking then at a science-based trajectory from an industry average for energy use, and this is for office buildings or commercial organisations, and how we eventually get towards a Paris-proof target. And this is for all buildings, so not just new builds. This is for the entire property sector. And then we begin layering in those various targets around the RIBA challenge, the UK GBC targets, and then just blending in there were a series of projects that we've done where we have post-occupancy data relating to those. And I think the lesson from this one for us is that around operational energy and new buildings, and then blending in a project that we're working on at the moment, this is relatively doable. I don't think this is the big issue. We can get there. We're already working on projects that are getting pretty close to the Paris-proof targets. And for information, the Wessex is a re-evaluation of a project from 20 years ago, and the Cambridge project is now, both of those are naturally ventilated. That's how they're getting there. So in many respects, and I think this has been mentioned several times already during the course of today, but it's when you begin comparing operational and embodied carbon, and this being operational carbon impacts from a fairly normal or average office building over a number of years, and comparing that to the embodied carbon that takes place before the building is ever occupied. And you can see if you take these as cumulative totals, those actually never meet. And of course, that white line doesn't even include repair, maintenance, refurbishment, or anything of that ilk. Those lines don't actually ever meet. So embodied carbon, we think, is becoming much, much more significant. And really, the two big things for us are embodied carbon of new builds and how we deal with the existing building stock. But and then looking at embodied carbon, we can see where we are with those targets. And so similarly with a science-based trajectory, blending in the various targets from the RIBA, from LETI, etc. And then a series of projects blending in. And here really sequestration is the big question. Can't you account for sequestration? I think it's very important it is accounted for separately. The project at the bottom, Q2, is an all timber CLT sports hall. And then there is a project that is blending in Timber Square, which I'll talk about in a second, and a few some studies that we've been doing as part of a UK Green Building Council research piece around how do we get much closer to that target of around 200 kilograms per metre squared, which is what we're aiming for, bearing in mind that the industry average is probably somewhere north of a tonne or 1,000 kilograms at the moment. And I think, bearing in mind that I think operational energy, where we're not there, and I don't want to underplay how important it is, but the process of design for performance that Gary was referring to, of understanding in new stuff, I think we can get there on new builds. This is the much, much more tougher nut to crack, but it is also the materials of which architecture is made. And so in some respects, we're more excited by the potential for what embodied carbon does to the architecture that we conceive and how we approach that. And I think for a long time, long as an office been much more interested in the stuff on the left-hand side of this than on the right-hand side. I mean, that sort of rootless anywheresville is horrific environmentally, but horrific as well, just experientially. And I think looking at vernacular architecture, the resourcefulness of that, the way that local materials have been used to deal with prevailing climate, is it produces buildings that are much more rooted within the environment in which they sit, but they are just more resourceful as well. And so we've always drawn great solace from those and interest from those. But more recently, I certainly have got much more interested in people like Egon Eyman and the emphasis on resourcefulness, particularly sort of mid-century German almost minimalist architecture. It's a very, very sparing use of resources. And I certainly was never that interested personally in the sort of fetishization of weight and how much does your building weigh until quite recently. And I think that's become a much more prevalent part of the agenda and the interest that we have. And how can we begin developing buildings that are more resource efficient? And that can be either very lightweight materials, or it can be much more regional materials. And these are two projects, Wessex Water from 20 years ago and a house that we did in Cumbria more recently. And actually, just by looking at where the materials come from, you do begin to get something that is more rooted in where it is. And those heavy materials don't have to be transported very far for transport to be the greatest factor in their load, whereas lighter materials can be transported slightly further. But I'm quite interested in the way that then begins to alter the architecture that we have, and the way that it looks, it feels, it smells even. And then increasingly, this is a project in Manchester where we first started looking at the idea of carbon VE or sustainability VE, as well as more conventional cost VE, and having a carbon tracker all the way through a project. What does that do? What does it remove? A lot of this is just the removal of finishes. I mean, Maria Smith earlier was talking about the way in which perhaps we have fetishized the way in which buildings are constructed and authenticity, etc. But I do think there is something in, by stripping away extraneous or needless finishes, we can get to buildings that are much more existential in their nature, and expressing the construction of those is a key part of that. And enjoying much more the top right hand portion of this slide is the materials that the building are made of. This is all recycled, reused, reclaimed materials that we're using on Timber Square. And moving on into reuse as well, that is a hugely important part of what we do. It's about a third of the 2/3 of our workload now is always in reuse. And then Timber Square, which I'm just moving on to very quickly, really this was a convergence of modern methods of construction, workplace and sustainability, and we're interested in the intersections between those and how they begin reinforcing one another. And broadly, it's a partial reuse of the 1950s printworks. We're retaining about 85% of that, extending one portion of it, and then building a new building to the west of that. And one of the leitmotifs really is around public realm and express terraces, and those have become much, much more important in the expression of the buildings, but also in their amenity. And there's much more emphasis on external space and health and well-being within that. But a big driver of this has really been around embodied carbon. I think on operational energy, it's doing pretty well. It's particularly, as I've said previously, the design for performance, optimized facade ratios, etc., are all extremely important parts of that. But it's the embodied carbon agenda which is really driving the project. And so the combination of reuse and a steel timber hybrid structure are roughly halving the embodied carbon over a more conventional project, I think. And this has been done, this is for Land Securities down in Southwark. And we're getting buildings that are by it's a 6 metre span, or beam to beam, with cross laminate timber spanning between those. They will probably start on site in the late part of spring, and with demolition of the parts that are being demolished. And then we're getting a much, much lighter building. So in places, this is between 20 and 25% physically lighter. But I think as well, it produces a very, very different aesthetic from the office buildings that we were designing only a few years ago. And much more exposed surfaces, exposed soffits, etc. But all done within fairly conventional floor-to-floor heights. And I think as well, part of the character is coming from the reuse of that building. And so, if anything, I think the reused portions are probably more valuable now in financial terms than they were. And at one point they would have been seen perhaps as compromise and the slightly lesser spaces, but they're now in many respects seen as the more characterful spaces potentially. And that series of decisions around materials, around reuse, the types of spaces that we have, I think is driving a much more spatially diverse and materially diverse workplace, and I think that is only a good thing. So I'm actually quite excited by that as an architectural position, and allowing sustainability, embodied carbon, reused materials, recycled materials to drive the aesthetic agenda has been a key part of this project. And then the other bit is also around glazing ratios and orientation. And so here the glazing ratios morph as we move around the building. I think we have to be a bit careful about blanket statements around glazing ratios and things of that ilk. And there is a careful balance as well between optimizing embodied carbon and the means in which a facade is built. And so in non-domestic buildings, it's quite a different game to more domestic scale buildings. And so in this case, the glazing ratios change. This is going from the north facade on the left-hand side to the southern facades on the others. And this is really morphing from glazing ratios of around 80%, and they're dropping to 40% as we move around and up the building. And you can just see the way in which the cladding has been conceived to both perform solar shading with the structure of the cladding on the outside, but also through having opaque and translucent elements, we're able to play around with the glazing ratios much more as we move around the building. And then a few of the external shots of that building in Southwark. And then just coming on to the sort of last few slides. Part of what we've been looking at as well with the UK Green Building Council is then how do we begin to hit those stretch targets, those sort of ultimate 2035 targets. And as I said, operationally, I think we're fairly confident how we move from a conventional baseline to those stretch targets. And in embodied terms, I think this is where it gets much more difficult. And so this was the subject of a report around both the technical and the cost feasibility of this. And the project that I just showed is within that intermediate sphere for embodied carbon, a little bit more towards a stretch on operational stuff. But we do need to move towards much lower embodied carbon buildings, and we have been looking at all timber versions of roughly the same buildings and much more use of mixed mode ultimately in the future going forwards. And then this is just this is the final slide looking at how we raise the bar. These are a couple of projects on the drawing board at the moment. Not for public release at the moment, but we're beginning to look at all timber structures, and I think there's something very exciting about that. There is a decline in efficiency by looking at that more than there is an uptick in cost. And then also a project in Asia, a research facility where we are looking much more at external microclimates and the way in which we can reduce the amount of building that we need by looking at external microclimates. And we're hoping that that might be the first Living Building Challenge project that we're able to do, so that becomes a building that produces more energy than it consumes. And that was the final slide, so thank you very much.
Peter, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Looks like you guys are doing some amazing work. I just got a couple of questions, actually, if that's okay. And one of them is just, I started thinking at the beginning of your talk, how important is it that architects, help educate their clients? That can sound quite contrived, but I just mean, help take them on the journey and understand some of the things that perhaps they weren't really that keen on before. Things like reusing materials, for example.
I think it is to a degree. I think the key thing is understanding what the pressures on them are. And I think at the moment within the property world, there's often a disconnect between corporate strategic aims, which are usually quite laudable, and maybe the more tangible day-to-day action. There's a little bit of a disconnect between those. And so that's why we've been very interested in how we understand our own impacts and how that impacts our corporate emissions, so we can understand the clients much more. And I think being able to just take people on that journey, which is more rationally based. It's based on data. It isn't particularly emotional in some respects. That said, I mean, for one particular example is around the use of recycled raised access floors. And for a while, that was just a no-no because they weren't shiny. And agents would walk onto a floor and they weren't shiny, and that was deemed not great. But as soon as it's understood that that actually has a massive embodied carbon impact, it's actually flipped. And so we're finding now that agents, demand you recycle raised access floors once they understand the narrative behind it. And I think that's why
Yeah.
we're quite interested in that use of materials and the stories behind materials, because once the narrative is clearer to people, it's more graspable. And so I think then it becomes part of the positive story rather than them sometimes just being perceived as slightly lesser materials. They're more damaged, they're less shiny, or whatever they are. But once there's an
Mhm.
understanding about the reason that they're like that, then I think that the uptake is much more um, likely and indeed encouraged. So I think we've seen a
Yeah.
slight flip of that.
Okay. It's fascinating. And that sort of leads me into my next question, I think. So, yeah, in terms of good architecture, that's both the aesthetic and the function. Is it compatible with sustainability?
I think it's absolutely got to be. Fundamentally, we use energy in buildings when we're not comfortable. So if we've got buildings that are rooted how in what makes people comfortable, that's the disconnect that we lost during the 20th century. We have to remember that until maybe the mid part of the 19th century, almost all buildings were a net zero carbon. They didn't really consume energy. And so I think actually buildings that are rooted in how people occupy them and the comfort criteria that they have, that is more beautiful architecture. And a lot of the things that we're programmed to perceive as beautiful, tall ceilings, the way that light comes in through Georgian windows, I'm pretty sure that the reason we find those beautiful is because they're actually very good environments. So I don't think there's a disconnect at all. Quite the opposite. I think they're totally, um, you know, the bedfellows of exactly the same
Yeah.
concerns, and I think we've been sidelined by iconic aesthetic issues for half a century or so, and we've got to get back to buildings that are rooted in human need.
Peter, that's fascinating. I've never heard anybody say that before, but you're absolutely right. That, you know,
I mean,
historically
actually,
buildings were net zero carbon. That's brilliant.
yeah,
Fascinating.
well, and Rab Bennett's, the founder of Bennett's Associates, has long, this is going back quite a few years, has always said that sustainability in many respects is a Trojan horse for just good architecture. If we just do better buildings, then those are often de facto more sustainable
Yeah.
buildings.
Yeah.
And that story's slightly changed. I don't think we're using it as a Trojan horse anymore because sustainability is enough in its own right now for many
Yeah.
people.
I guess that, we're touching that's sort of the operational side of it in terms of the carbon. But why is embodied carbon so important? Why is it important that we get a handle on that?
It's just such a significant part of the the energy that we consume to make products. I mean, it's about 40% of industrial processes are in some way, shape, or form going into how we make buildings, and also transport, actually. So the bit
Yeah.
that I didn't mention particularly, but by having a building that's lighter, you have less transport associated with it. But as many people have said this morning as well, the key thing is first and foremost, we just reuse the stock that we've got. The most sustainable, the least embodied energy is the stuff that already exists. So I think dealing with that and then using as minimal resources as we possibly can, and if at all possible, materials that are sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere to become positive, um, has to help us on the journey that we need to go on.
Yeah. And obviously, that's that to go on that journey. You need engagement from clients, architects, but also builders, construction companies, and also manufacturers. Is that happening at the speed we need?
It's happening. It's probably not quite happening at the speed that we need, but I do think that the the process of change, it is quite rapid at the moment, and I've actually been really surprised how much that has changed in the last couple of years. And there's a lot more engagement around supply chains around that, and it's getting
Peter,
a lot easier to get data out of subcontractors and major builders, etc. So I'm reasonably optimistic around that at the moment.
and that's a perfect note to end it on. Peter, that was absolutely fascinating. We could have talked for much longer, but we can't, I'm afraid, because we've got a session coming. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
welcome back to Stream One. It's been fascinating already. We only had 2 sessions so far. There's a few more to go. And next, we are going to be hearing from Andrea Carlson from London on circular construction in regenerative strategies and how we can bridge the gap between theory, practice, and policy. Welcome, Andrea.